Hi, everybody. I'm Hugh Liebert, Associate Professor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and a faculty member with the Hertog Foundation this summer. I'm very pleased to be here this evening to moderate a conversation with Victor Davis Hanson. Professor Hanson is the Martin and Illy Anderson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's a prolific writer on topics as varied as Greek history, warfare, both ancient and modern, farming and agriculture, and contemporary culture and politics. His many books include The Second World Wars, The Savior Generals, How Five Great Commanders Saved Wars That Were Lost, and A War Like No Other, A History of the Peloponnesian Wars. He was awarded the National Humanities Medal in 2007 and the Bradley Prize in 2008. In the first half of this evening's conversation, I'm going to pose a few questions to Professor Hanson. We'll then hear from 3 political studies fellows who have submitted questions in advance. We'll then take questions from our wider audience. You can submit these questions via Zoom's Q&A function. If your question is selected, you'll be recognized to ask your question. There's no need to wait. You're welcome to begin submitting your questions right now. Okay, Professor Hanson, I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you this evening. I don't think we've met before, but I've read a bunch of your books with great pleasure. Including 2 in grad school, your 2 first books, Warfare and Agriculture in Classical Greece and The Western Way of War. And both of them, had a really significant influence on me. I think what I found most impressive about them was the way that your experience growing up on a 20th century farm opened up these wonderful new insights into texts that we've been living with for thousands of years. So I thought if you'd be willing, if you could just start by telling us a little bit about, your personal background and how you got into classics and wrote these early books.
Well, I kind of lived in an isolated area in rural California in the Central Valley, and I grew up on my grandfather's ranch with my parents, and it was sort of a communal living. We had all the family there, and we were kind of free range as kids. We just wandered over 140 acres as we pleased, and somebody in the family would bump into us. So I learned to farm pretty well in high school, and then it was so isolated I wanted to get out. So I went away to undergraduate and graduate school for 9 years. I lived 2 years in Greece, and then in 1980, for a variety of reasons, I didn't want to teach. I didn't like academia, but I had finished my thesis on warfare and agriculture in classical Greece. And I tried to incorporate, everybody tries to incorporate things And when I would read secondary sources on the Peloponnesian War, the communal opinion was that the Spartans came in and period of, depending on which of the 5 invasions, 2 weeks, 10 days, 5 weeks, they destroyed all of the agriculture. And there was some textual support for that in Thucydides. We would say they ravaged Attica. But when you went and looked at his specific, more detailed elaboration, that's common with him in a sense to contradict himself. He would say they ravaged all the things they'd missed before. They ravaged the demes that they had skipped. And then I'd grown up taking out orchards with chainsaws and bulldozers and tractors, and especially vines. I mean, if you pull out a vine, sometimes the roots will go down 15 feet, and you've really got to dig them up with a bulldozer. I tried to save money once and did it with a chain and a tractor, and all I did was have vines come up all over the field in a new orchard. So I didn't quite believe the secondary literature, and it's very hard to burn grain unless you do it at a particular time of the year. It's only combustible for about 2 to 3 weeks, and that's the time when it's usually harvested. And when you add the olive trees, very hard. I have olive trees. It was very hard to cut them down or to keep them cut down. So the long and the short of it was I suggested that the agriculture was not as damaged as one thought. That was known in advance probably to the Athenians for all of their psychological torment at seeing their homes destroyed. And it does explain why in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, Athens did not suffer a half century of depression. It was pretty much back on its feet within a decade.
I guess the reason that that struck me as such a great approach to this is that, like, if you'd asked me, I mean, I did not grow up on a farm. I know very little about farming. I kill everything I plant, you know. But if you'd asked me, like, what are among the things that have changed significantly from ancient Greece to our time, agriculture would have been, you know, somewhere near the top of my list. So I guess the like larger question that the way you approach those texts raises is, you know, how to distinguish between what's kind of timeless in an ancient text and what is more contingent historically or dependent on technology. And I get the sense that in a lot of your work that the kind of range of what's timeless and what we can learn from and apply in our own world is broader than it is for a lot of classicists. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of us are Thucydideans, and as he says explicitly, that given that human nature doesn't change, that what he says in 425 or 430 or 415, whenever he's particularly writing, given the necessary adjustments, it'll be true forever, because we in our confidence in the 21st century believe maybe with improved, I don't know, medicines or diet or genetic, I don't know why, but we feel that we've changed human nature in the therapeutic sense. I don't think we have. And then as far as agriculture, I think I could make the argument that my great grandmother and grandfather, the implements that they had on my farm, some of which are still there, had not changed since Thucydides' time. That is, they homesteaded in 1871. They had horses, they had a wagon. The wagon doesn't look too differently than what Hesiod talks about or what you see in Greek vase painting. It was horse-driven. They didn't have organochloride or organophosphate. They used nicotine, believe it or not, and sulfur. Sulfur was known to the Greeks. When you look at Theophrastus and other authors on agricultural science, they're very sophisticated. And they talk about how to exterminate birds and using peppers and stringent foods that can burn as kind of primitive pesticides. So I found that agriculture changed radically around 1910, 1920. But until then, I don't think it was much changed at all. There was some mechanization earlier, but what changed it was technology, the Industrial Revolution, chemicals, petrochemicals, and now computers and genomes and things like that. But the essence has not changed. You still have to put a seed in the ground, or you have a plant in the ground, and it's not like Mike Bloomberg said, you just drop it in and it comes, anybody can do it. It's always going to be an art. Yeah. And I know very sophisticated farmers, I talked to one yesterday, that for all of their computer knowledge, they don't know why one particular field or one particular vineyard or orchard will not produce as well as another. There's too many variables about soil, many climates, agricultural technique, but it's an art. It remains an art.
Human nature and cultivating human nature is like that too, that there are too many variables, it's too complicated, so we can only approach it as an art and not as a science that we can really master.
Well, we're in a Thucydidean time, so I think when we look at the panic of the COVID virus, it comes right out of the pages of Thucydides, that we've had just as much. He talked about all of the false knowledge about whether you can get it twice and whether you died, didn't die, and what were the symptoms. It was very scientific, but we don't know very much more about this COVID than they did about the plague, in the sense that we were told not to wear masks sometimes, always wear mask. You have antibodies, you have immunity, you have antibodies, you might have immunity. If you get a vaccine, it'll be impossible in a year. It might be within a year. It might need 2 shots. It might not give you immunity. You might have T-cell immunity. If your blood type is O negative, you might not get it versus A positive. All of this is still up in the air. The only difference is that we speculate with far more precision and detail because we have more knowledge at our fingers. But these things are still beyond our exact knowledge. Right now they are. And so human nature fills that void. And we have people, if we were going into a supermarket anywhere in the United States, on April 1st, you would not find hand sanitizers, you would not find toilet paper, and you would not find Clorox wipes, because everybody felt they had to get them first, and because they had to protect their families, and they just hoarded. And that's right out of the pages of Thucydides. If you look at the lockdown and the paranoia, I have people with PhDs that I know that work at the Hoover Institution, I won't mention names, that have not gone outside their homes, not once. And I know other people who they're right out of the pages of Thucydides. They feel that because they go out and work and they expose themselves and they take care of people that they know in their family have been ill, they may get it, but they do it anyway. And Thucydides kind of cynically says, well, maybe they wanted to show they were virtue and they died. But I don't see much, I don't see things changing much at all, as far as names change, the conditions change, but human nature doesn't change.
What about this element of how Thucydides talks about the plague, where he says everyone lives as though there's not going to be a long time ahead of them. So they're kind of living for today and doing things in public that they would normally only do in private. Is that true now too?
Well, I think so, because I mean, the mayor of New York said right on the aid, go out and live it up before we have a lockdown, you know, and people did that and they spread the plague. But I think that's true when you look at, it was a disconnect for me to be told you have to social distance, masks, sanitizers, don't go out to the store unless you need. And then all of a sudden, on May 25th, after the tragic death of George Floyd, then we had millions pour into the street. And they were doing all the things that you're not supposed to do. They were next to each other, they were spitting, they were singing. That type of vocal activity is very contagious. And they felt, you know what, I want to do this for a variety of good and bad reasons, and I don't really care what happens to me. And of course, a lot of them were young and got infected, but not symptomatic. And I think that helped, although the media doesn't detail it, that helped spread this second wave, which is a lesser wave, but nonetheless, the idea was I'm cooped up, I'm going to do what I want, and I don't really care about getting sick.
So another way in which we're in a Thucydidean moment is, you know, Thucydides is very, you know, much in the news now for helping us think about China, the strategic situation with China, the U.S.-China relationship, thanks to Graham Allison's book, and a bunch of other people have taken that up and debated it. I'm just curious what you make of that book. Does Allison basically get it right about how Thucydides, you know, what he has to teach us about the U.S.-China relationship, or is there something that he misses?
Well, I mean, Thucydides says that he's trying to explain why the peace broke down and why Sparta preempted in the spring of 431. And he says at various places, but one place in particular, it was the fear of Athenian power. In other words, the implicit message that he makes there and also elsewhere is that Athens is a more dynamic nation state, a city state, and it's going to be more powerful in the future, and Sparta is going to be less powerful. And therefore, Sparta thought that if they did not preempt and intercede on behalf of various allies, perhaps on the goading of Corinth or in anticipation of Theban help or over areas up at Potidea, that they would lose influence and the people would go over to the Athenian side. And people have suggested that Thucydides trap is applicable to us in China, that China is sort of on the ascendance and that there's no stopping it, and that maybe the United States would like to check it, and therefore, I don't know if they're going to, Graham Allison said we're going to preempt, but that is the nature of this rivalry. I have very strong doubts about it, because if you read the first book of Thucydides, they had been at war for about 16 years in the first Peloponnesian War, and they had been rivals and had a falling out at a time when Athens was much weaker. So was Sparta, after the coalition to stop a resurgence of Persian entrance in the United States into the United city-states of Greece. they had a falling out. And why did they have a falling out? And Thucydides begins to list existential differences between the two. And there are many. Athens is a cosmopolitan seaport. Sparta is a sort of parochial, somewhat rural, although its agrarianism is very strange, but it's 17 miles from Githea, its port. So it's a landlocked, traditional bound, hoplite power. Athens is a naval power. It's a radical democracy. Sparta is an oligarchy. Athens has chattel slaves. Sparta has a very different system of heritage. And when you start categorizing those differences, they appear in Pericles' funeral oration as well. That funeral oration is really not just how exceptional Athens is and enlightened and liberal, it's how un-Spartan Athens is, because the comparisons and the allusions are explicit rather than implied. And so what I'm getting at is they had enough reasons to go to war at any stage of their development than they did at this moment in 431 because of fear of Phobos, of Athenian power. And the value I have in some of what's been written about China is that when Sparta goes to war and preempts in 431, they really don't have a plan that is how to neutralize Athenian power. The presumption is we go into Athenian territory and we ravage the farms, and they'll come out and we'll defeat them in a hoplite battle, and then by convention they'll quit, which is just ignorant of their economic power, the resources in the empire, and a fleet of 300 triremes. So that's valuable to see that countries go to war, nations go to war, as he says in relation to the Athenian empire, that, you know, we keep it for out of fear and pride and perceived self-interest, ophilos. But I think that's a very valuable lesson about the beginning of the war, why it took off. They really did not think very clearly how one side was going to defeat the other in a way that would ensure victory.
So I find that part of the text really, I don't know, it's confusing in a good way, I think, because the Spartan strategy in the first year of the war is preceded by this brilliant king, Archidamus, who's a guest friend of Pericles, and seems to really understand actually the sources of Athenian power, at least based on his speech in Book 1. He says, for instance, Sparta is eventually going to have to raise money and get a navy in order to win this war, and he's right about that. He has a very long view of how the war is going to play out. But he is also, it seems, the main thinker behind the Spartan strategy early in the war. He certainly is leading the Spartan forces when they invade Attica. How do we understand the difference between his speech, where he seems to have a clear sense of how the war is going to be fought, and his actions, where he seems to have less of an understanding of what Athens is all about?
Well, I think he's a man that knows his limitations. In other words, he has a vision that a commercial economy with money and sea power gives Athenians enormous advantages. And yet, as a dutiful Spartan, he knows that his forte is going to be a crack hoplite army, and he's going to go in there and he's going to accomplish the mission. He doesn't believe necessarily in this changed environment that the mission is going to be result in strategic victory.
I see. Okay.
Given their navy. But I don't think he has at this point the strategic imagination to come up with a strategy of victory that other Spartans do. We have these strange Spartans that are on the periphery. They're either bastards or nathoi, or they're disreputable. And there's two or three of them. The Brasidas is one, and he understands how to hit Athens in strategic areas and not necessarily with traditional hoplite armies. And then we have this brilliant kind of diabolical Gylippus that goes in and saves Syracuse. And then we have Lysander that understands that the person who's going to win, the side that's going to win the Peloponnesian War is the one that matches the other person's forte. So Athens is either going to get an army and defeat Sparta and humiliate it and destroy its alliance, or Sparta is going to get a navy and then cut it off from its grain and its tribute paying allies. And Sparta, kind of ironically, either figures it out first or figures it out best with Persian money. One thing that is important, that you can see how Athens could have beat Sparta, because we know how that happened under the great liberator Epaminondas in the winter of 370. He essentially said to himself, I'm tired of the Spartans coming up and ravaging every spring. And the Athenians had the right idea, but they didn't pursue it. Right idea being, they had the Battle of Mantinea. Had they won and they had greater numbers, they could have humiliated Spartan prowess. They had the right idea by going down to Sphacteria and Pylos and freeing the Helots, the source of their agricultural labor, but they didn't really pursue it very often. They had an armistice and they were worried about their own captives, so they stopped that. And then, more importantly, they had an idea of breaking off allies in the Peloponnese, or at least finding allies like the Argives, but they didn't pursue that. So what Epaminondas did was he got a huge army, not of some 20,000, but 70,000. He destroyed the notion of Spartan invincibility at Leuctra, and then he went down in a series of skirmishes. He went right up to the walls, I shouldn't say the walls, the hills of Sparta, humiliated the army. They didn't come out and fight. Then he fortified Megalopolis, the new city in Mantinea, and broke away their allies. And then he went over at the same time or early, he went over the hill and created this new Helot kingdom of Mantinea at, Messenia at its capital, this beautiful city at Messene. So he did all the things the Athenians had hinted at, but didn't have the wherewithal to do. And the result was Sparta was pretty much ended as a major power at last. So if you're going to defeat Sparta, you got to free their Helots, you got to break off their allies, fortify them, and change their political ideology, and then you have to humiliate the Spartan army and get right to the city of Sparta itself.
Yeah, so I have one last question for you. Then we have some questions from students. So Plutarch is one of my great loves. We don't have his life of Epaminondas, but we do have his life of Peloponnesius.
Yes.
And he holds these Theban heroes out, as best we can tell in the case of Epaminondas, as examples of how the right kind of liberal education can inform kind of statesman's view of the world, like make a good statesman. And this this theme of like liberal education and how it influences the kind of development of human beings is one of your great themes. So the role of classics in this. I thought maybe we could just end on that. I mean, why is it the case that the classics play a smaller role than they used to in the education of talented Americans? What would be better if it played a more prominent role?
Yeah, it's too bad because Plutarch was a schoolmaster at Chaeronea, so he was not only a Boeotian chauvinist, but he was a big advocate. I think he says in his life of Demosthenes how hard it is to get to the Athenian library. But but he was a big advocate of both traditional history and reverence for the past and education, and they're connected. So a country like the United States that doesn't know its past, then it exhibits symptoms that we're seeing today. 2 years ago, during the Charlotte riots, they tore down the statue of J.C. Lee, the World War II general who was a logistician in Paris, thinking that was Robert E. Lee's statue, sort of like Sin of the Poet and Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. They tore down they being whoever Antifa, they tore down Frederick Douglass's statue, or the great champion of Reconstruction, Ulysses S. Grant. So that reflects a reality that people are going K through 12 and they're not learning history. They may take a course called history, but it's basically melodrama or psychodrama where you go back to the past, you get a thin narrative, and then you apply the present standard of ethics or morality, and your duty is then to condemn certain people as bad. And of course, one bad act or one bad element cancels the entire person out. George Washington, because he has slaves, is as culpable as a murderer who had slaves. There's no redeeming characteristic in that view of history. And then it also lumps people together. So you say the entire wagon train going to Portland, Oregon in 1850 were all interloping colonial imperialists against noble indigenous peoples. You don't say that there were very brave people, some people who had a ruptured appendix, some people had kidney stones, some people who were sick with tuberculosis, and yet by sheer powers of endurance or imagination or benevolence, they did great things. But that doesn't matter once you render history this way as just cosmic forces or just people rather than individual persons. That's really a bad thing to do to history. And then finally, it's very hypocritical for the most affluent and wealthy generation in the world to here in the year 2021 to say Christopher Columbus goes down or Father Sarah. Nobody knows what it was like for Father Sarah to walk 800 miles when he was very, very ill and try to set in an area that was very wild to set up a series of things that he thought at the time were benevolent and would save souls and bring education and agriculture. And none of us could do that. None of us could do what Columbus did. So what is very aggravating is people who are so reliant on technology and leisure and affluence, they sort of just sit around and say, this person was not very good. This person, I don't like what he said. I don't like what that person wrote, but they have no idea what it would be like to wake up in the morning and not have 20/20 vision and not have glasses for the rest of your life, or to get a minor kidney stone and be dead, or to have a sore throat and die of diphtheria. And yet those people dealt with those physical challenges every day, and yet we don't give them any concessions that that savagery and brutality may have factored into their own ideology. And it did. And so they didn't have a lot of margin of error to be as liberal as we would like. And people, it's very easy, as Aristotle said, to be moral in your sleep. It's very easy to have the world at your fingertips with an iPhone and all the information, the history of civilization, and retrievable in a minute or two or less, and then say, I wish this person had done this, and he doesn't fit my standards. That person would come out of the grave and say, you know what? I'd like to see you on the Santa Maria on the 58th day out from Barcelona and see how you would do. And I don't think, and if you think that Columbus was evil, then you could say, and you like the Aztecs, you could say, I'd like to see you as an Aztec priest at that point in 1521, see how it was. But nobody ever puts themselves into the historical framework of somebody else. So that disdain for the past or that rejection of the past, it explains why we're such a rootless culture, that we have no sense of honor or shame. We don't owe anything to people who are dead. When I see Antifa go after these monuments, I always say, what are they going to replace it with? Why don't they set up another, get rid of the Woodrow Wilson School? Fine, I'm not a big fan of Wilson, but give me another name. Find me another name who's perfect, not just merely good, because that's the standard. Or if you deface the World War II monument, I'd like to tell them, what would you do on Sugarloaf Hill on May 19th, 1945 in Okinawa? How well would you perform against an army that had killed 15 million people in China, another 6 million in Asia? What would you do to stop them?
Yeah, you know, one of the students in the Thucydides seminar that I'm teaching noticed today these wonderful details that Thucydides gives us, and the way they have of just, you know, putting us immediately into the world that he's describing, you know, so we can really stand where the characters he's writing about stood and see the world, you know, the problem, challenges they faced, all of that. All right, well, we have a few student questions now that I have to turn to. So we're going to hear from Ben Schwabe of Michigan State University, James Beckwith of St. John's College in Annapolis, and Natasha DeVirgilio of Hillsdale College. Maybe we can start with Ben Schwabe from Michigan State.
Hi, Dr. Hanson. Thank you for coming to speak with us. I was struck in your article, Why is Everyone Suddenly Quoting Thucydides, that you lauded the Trump administration for their adherence to Thucydides' insights. But his work is also perennially misunderstood and simplified. For instance, we hear a lot about the Athenian argument that fear, honor, and interest are the crucial motivators of action, but we hear much less about how justice and piety affect deliberation, as in the case of Nicias. Given this widespread failure of interpretation, should we not also be wary of invocations of Thucydides?
Well, I mean, if you read Cornford's Thucydides, or you read Dover's comments on Thucydides, everybody has a different Thucydides. So I wish when I was in graduate school, everybody said Thucydides was the scientific reporter, and he was to be contrasted with Herodotus, who spun tales. And then by the time I became a professor, it was Thucydides said in book 121 that he was a scientific reporter, but he did that as disinformation. And we know all of the events of the Peloponnesian War, and he picked and chose some events that wouldn't have been very important to other people, and he magnified them because they reflected a preconceived view of the world. And versus Herodotus, who just threw it all out there and reported what people said, and therefore it was much more honest. So what I'm getting at is that everybody there's no consensus really on what Thucydides is, except we have to ask ourselves, why did he take particular passages in the history that we know from Diodorus and Plutarch may not have been as important, or as he says they are, or in a disinterested fashion might not have warranted so much emphasis. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about the incident in Mytilene in the Mytilenean debate, and the murder, or the execution, I should say, of the insurrectionaries on Lesbos. Or why did he give us such a graphic description of a pretty minor incident at Corcyra, the stasis at Corcyra? I don't think the Melian debate really warrants much. The fate of Melos, it's a pretty small island. They did that to a lot of people, and yet that looms large. And then why that very graphic description of the Athenians at the Asopus River fighting each other to have a muddy drink of water? And I think the answer is, and then of course the plague, he's fascinated about human nature and why pretension, civilization, assumptions of moral superiority, progress even, they can be stripped away very, very easily, either by a natural event like a plague, or through a sort of a Jacobin revolution, as we saw at Corfu, Corcyra, or the volatile Athenian democracy just trying to outbid each other in sheer braggadocio, so they ordered the Mytileneans to be executed 24 hours later, not executed, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the one commonality that we can glean from all this is that I think the word realist is accurate, and I feel that he has a very suspect view of human nature. He's not critical of it. He just assumes that without the bridles of tradition, family, community, he's not religious himself, but he believes there's a role as a deist, I suppose we could call it, use that anachronistic term. He believes there's a role for religion, but all of these are efforts not to allow people to reveal their inner self, their innate humanness. Now, he doesn't mean that it's not necessarily bad all the time. He just says that under stress, civilization's thin veneer will be peeled away, and what happens at Mytilene or Melos or in Sicily or during the plague's not going to be very pretty. And I think that's about as much as we can say about his worldview. And he also has one final qualifier. He has this idea of these dichotomies he makes: logon, ergon, logos, ergon. What people say and what they do are two different things. The prophasis, the alleged reason, and the aitia, the real reason. And so he believes that human nature being what it is, people say all sorts of things and profess all sorts of nice things. But unfortunately, you have to judge them by what they actually do and what the actual cause or the motivator is, not what the pretense is, what they say they're motivated by. And so that is you could say that was a cynical view of human nature as well.
Thank you, Ben. Up next is James Beckwith of St. John's College in Annapolis.
Thank you so much for your time today. I want to ask, in your article on Thucydides, you draw reference to Periclean figures who are able to transcend the party politics between elites and common crowds without resorting to the demagoguery of Cleon or the fecklessness of Nicias. Alcibiades seems to be the most direct continuation of the Periclean tradition in Athenian politics, balancing both oratory flourish with a long training in philosophy and statesmanship. Yet you name him as a figure who should not be followed. I'm curious, what about Alcibiades, given his demonstrated effectiveness throughout the war, precludes him from consideration as a figure able to embody the dynamism and daring of the democratic demos?
Yeah. Well, of course, we have a portrait of Alcibiades. We probably know more about him than any Athenian of his generation, because we not only have the portrait in Thucydides, but we have that portrait in Plato's Symposium. We have some in Aristophanes, and we have Plutarch. And I think the way we're to look at him is that he is excessive, that he doesn't believe in to meson, the mean, but he has enormously great gifts. And if you're going to incorporate him within the strategic framework and you make that decision, what's really a fatal, I think, in Thucydides' view, is if you entrust him to be one of the three architects of the Sicilian expedition, he would probably give the best advice. But don't recall him right in the middle of this endeavor. Or if you're going to bring him back from exile, and he's very good in the first three naval engagements, and you're having some ascendance, then don't recall him on a minor technicality. And so I think Aristophanes compared him like we raised a lion, and you don't raise a lion and turn him loose and then be upset that he causes trouble. And so there is a little bit of Trumpian in him that, I find some of the presidents tweeting a little bit too much, but you don't have a guy like president and then say, you know what, don't tweet. It's inseparable from who he is. And I think that's I think the objective analysis or summation of Alcibiades is probably the most talented man of his generation, and he's also the least controllable and the least control of his own passions and appetites. And that's the way contemporaries saw him. And that means that he was a tragic figure, because, there's nothing more tragic at that scene in Xenophon's history at Aigospotamoi when he comes out of exile and he says to the commanders of the Athenian fleet, if you'll just move your boats and your camp, you're very exposed. This is silly. And they say, we don't listen to you anymore. And then their entire fleet is destroyed. So it's very hard to find out where he gives advice that's flawed. The Mantinean gambit of 418, that was a pretty smart idea. The problem was the Athenians didn't really support it, but it was a way to destroy the army without having your footprints, handprints all over breaking the peace. So he's a very gifted person, but due to his character flaws, he's not able, in a way that Pericles was, or maybe even Themistocles was, to win people over to his side because of his personal flamboyance and excess. So there is something Trumpian about him. Trump has enormous animal cunning and abilities, but he's not able, for a variety of reasons that are tied up with his own success. It's kind of like a tragic. I think I wrote an article about the tragic hero in Sophocles and John Ford's Westerns, other Westerns as well, and Trump, is that you bring in somebody like that has the skills to deal with the cattle barons or the bandits, but in the process of dealing with that existential threat that the community can't deal with, you see elements of his character or modalities or that are not commiserate with what a civilization should do. They're not compatible. And so when the existential threat is gone, you want to get rid of him. So every Western, whether it's Shane or the Wild Bunch or the Magnificent, they got to get out. They've done the job, they got to get out. And so I think Alacibiades is sort of that way. He can't live in the society that he helped save.
Thanks, James. Up next, we have Natasha DeVirgilio of Hillsdale College. Natasha.
Hi, Professor Hanson.
Thank you.
In your scholarship, you bring together a wide range of disciplines with a focus on politics and classics and history. I think your answer to this question has been coming through today, but I'd like to ask directly, why is it that you remain interested in studying these subjects? And can you speak specifically to how your education and scholarship continue to inform your understanding of contemporary political questions?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing is that too often people combine ignorance with arrogance, and arrogance is a result of ignorance, and that is, the more you read from the past, the more I think it's a humbling experience that you feel there's nothing new under the sun. So when you see what we're going through now, you might want to read Procopius on the plague, or you might want to read Thucydides on the plague, and they can be, or you could read Boccaccio on the plague. If you look at what Antifa's doing or BLM's doing, you know, mutatis mutandis, you could say, well, there's a lot of things that Robespierre and the Jacobins did, and counter-revolutionaries, revolutionaries, the Thermidors, etc., all the way to Napoleon. And you can understand the cycles, the iterations of a cultural revolution, or look at Mao's Red Guards. Now, everybody's going to find examples that may substantiate preconceived ideas, but once they use those examples, they're open to refutation. So if you do that, then people are going to criticize you. So what I'm getting at is it gives a humble, it gives also a reassuring humbleness to people that I'm not here alone. Other people have dealt with the same situation. I used to have a very brilliant young woman who was just exasperated that she felt we were a working class university I taught at, that she didn't get the laurels that were commiserate with her ability. And I'd always say, go read Antigone and see how that feels. And when some other person was in a situation, I had another guy who was an athlete, and all he did was say that I should have been MVP and MVP. And I said, you sound like old Ajax whining about why you didn't get the armor of Achilles. And I said, that's your role. You're the bulwark of the line. You're the best linebacker, but you're not flashy. So you're not going to be cited, but you have to find a heroism out of that dilemma. So the past will allow you to do that. It gives you a reverence for people who are dead. We're all going to die. And I think it also gives you a sense of measurement. So you don't, when you see some tragic figure who made mistakes and maybe endanger their legacy, you don't cancel them out. You try to, that doesn't mean you lessen your criticism of them, but you try to put them in a context. During these demonstrations, everybody's looking again at the Civil War, and they've rejected the narrative that grew up over the last 50 years. That Ken Burns actually, I don't know if he would do it again, but that narrative was thematic in his Civil War iconic documentary. And it was, the Civil War was a tragedy because 6 or 7% of the nation's household in the border states and in the South owned slaves. And there was really no middle class because of slavery in the South. And there were a lot of very poor white people who hated the plantation class. And yet that war could not have gone on unless those people took up arms against the plantation class, which was not their own. And they took up arms for what they said was the sanctity of their soil, whatever misplaced idea in 2021 it seems. That was the tragedy, that 700,000 people died because about 500,000 Southerners fought for an institution that wasn't in their own interest, but which they felt was not the central issue. It was their pride or their traditions or being Southern. And that was a terrible tragedy, and it marred the country. But now we've gotten rid of that entire theme. And we've said, if you're James Longstreet and you fought for the South, you're evil, tear down your statue. If your great-great-grandfather fought at Gettysburg on the wrong side, then your family is culpable. And I just don't think history works that way in this black and white cookie cutter way, because you can see that in these revolutionary times that we're living, we don't have substitutions. We don't have, when I was in the 60s, when I was on a campus and they went and destroyed something, they always said, we don't like the name of Adlai Stevenson College. We want Malcolm X College. Or they would say, we got to do this. We want this. But I don't see that even. I just see that let's tear everything down. But who are the people that they want to resurrect in their place? And partly the reason is that once you're in a revolutionary fervor and you make these rules that one mistake cancels you out forever, and there's no statute of limitations on sin, then it's very hard to find anybody left that would qualify under those stringent prerequisites. So history, I think, tells us all that. You know, I said at an interview not long ago, somebody was talking about a statue. He said, so sad, they were so artistically formed, why don't they cut off the head? I said they should learn from the Romans. Damnatio memoriae, when you had an emperor who was unpopular and you got rid of him, you kind of decapitated him, and you kind of didn't really have to do the whole 9 yards because the body was elegantly crafted and you put a new head on. I think maybe they could do that. It would save everybody a lot of grief. But they don't have any heads to replace them with. That's the problem.
All right, we have at least two more student questions. We have Nico Donahue of American University and Cameron Vega of Arizona State University. We'll start with Nico.
Yes, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to ask these questions. So you raised the possibility of the Thucydidean lesson of war involving the, and I quote, value of mavericks who do not adhere to Athenian populist or Spartan oligarchic stereotypes, end quote. And it prompted me to question the relationship among war and a cohesive civil society. So I'm wondering if you could speak on this relationship. If this is one of the many lessons to take away from Thucydides' history, is there a tension between the stability and cohesion of a civil society and the necessity of mavericks for success in war?
There is, but they square that circle pretty well. And by that, I mean, I'll give you one example of what I'm talking about. So before the war, there was this maverick named Curtis LeMay, and he went to Ohio State. He dropped out, but he was probably the most brilliant aviator we had. He flew all the way down to Buenos Aires and back in a B-17 in 1937. He got Bell's palsy during the flight, if you can imagine, a mini stroke. He put a cigar in his mouth. He had a cigar there the rest of his life. He flew 25 missions as a two-star general over Europe. And then when the B-29 program came in to fruition in 1944, it was a bigger investment than the Manhattan atomic bomb, and it was going nowhere. The planes were not reliable. They couldn't get up to 30,000 feet as designed. It was over-designed. It had been rushed in. It was going to be a $2 billion flop. So what did they do? They fired General Hanson, and they brought this crazy LeMay in, the guy who, you know, actually got in the lead plane to bomb the oil factories in Romania as a B-17 when they told him not. And what did he do? He took this beautiful plane, he took it down to 6,000 feet. He took a lot of the armament off the plane. He loaded it up with a new thing called napalm. He figured out that the jet spring that blew the bombs off course would be an ally, not a detriment. They would fan the flames, and the rest is history. He burned 75% of the urban core of Japan out, killed over 400,000 people, civilians among them, primarily civilians, and he basically ended the war. The bombs may have been the final coup, but we didn't need to drop the bombs. If you had let Curtis LeMay continue from newly acquired Okinawa, he would have burned down the whole country with bombers coming from now the European theater that was over. So what do? We put him on Time magazine. LeMay the hero. LeMay saves B-29 program. LeMay destroy, and then the war is over, and we say to ourselves, "Oh my God! Look at this! Look what we did. We burned people." And then we have this thing called strategic air command that he's taken over, and Dr. Strangelove is a caricature of Curtis LeMay. Two of the characters are composite. He's a madman. During the Cuban Missile, we don't want him. He ran for vice president with George Wallace, 1968. He's a nut. Get rid of him. And that's what we do. Same thing with George Patton. He's crazy. We don't want anything to do with him. He said this, he said that, he slapped a soldier. Put George Patton in the right place at the right time with Third Army in July 28th, and there's no other person that can get 500 miles into German territory and end the war in 1944. He could have done it had they supported him. And then after that, if he's in trouble with the bulge, do not count on Monty, do not count on Eisenhower, do not count on Hodges. There's only one man that can turn 3 divisions on a 90-degree angle in 24 hours and go to Bastogne and save it. And yet he did that. And now what is he considered? A crank, a nut, a romantic. He slept with his stepniece. He mouthed off. So we have these people that come out of the woodwork in times of peril. And we have their gunslingers that come in, as I said, to save the little community from the cattle barons that bully everybody, kind of like Shane in that movie, if you've ever seen it. But you don't really want them around because the modalities that they're forced to use are anti-civilizational. They're not conducive to calm and peace. And everybody, when he died, Omar Bradley, who was a mediocre general, said, it's kind of good that Georgie died when he did because there was no place for him. And that seemed very cruel, but there was a certain truth to it. So we have people who do things in time of war that save us, but they remind us that we really shouldn't have done it when we enjoy the luxuries of peace. And it's hard for us to admit that, but war is something that's not civilizational. And when we get very nice men that are really wonderful people, like Courtney Hodges or, Omar Bradley, wonderful man, or Ira Eaker, a wonderful man, and you put them in charge of hundreds of thousands of people, they will get a lot of people killed because they're nice men. When you put somebody who may not be, I'm not saying you have to be a bad guy to be a good general, but I'm saying sometimes bad guys are good generals. And sometimes nice people are bad generals. And if you make the conduct of war predicated on citizenship values, which you should in the abstract, but on the individual citizen, you said, that guy's a drunk, he smokes too much, he's an adulterer, he lied that time. You're never going to have that type of talent come forward. It takes a long time. I mean, I think I could make an argument if I had time to say William Tecumseh Sherman was bipolar and he was a complete failure before the war. And I think Ulysses S. Grant did drink too much, probably drunk at Shiloh. Without those two men, Lincoln wouldn't have won the war, at least not by 1865. But they were not the type of people that we would want to have a conversation with.
So we have two more questions, but only about 5 minutes. So I think I'll let both of these students ask their questions, and then you can respond to both of them, if that's okay, Professor Hanson. So we'll start with Cameron Vega from Arizona State University, and then we'll go right to Weston Boardman from Hillsdale. Go ahead, Cameron.
Hello, Dr. Hanson. Thank you for your time. My question is relating to Thucydides. Do innovative societies that take no rest and give none to others naturally drift towards impiety and hubris? And does the answer to this question offer any insights into human nature in Athenian-like regimes?
Could you repeat speak a little louder, just the first part?
Yes. Do innovative societies that take no rest and give none to others naturally drift towards impiety and hubris?
Weston, do you want to go ahead?
Yes. Can you hear me, Dr. Hanson?
Yes.
Great. I wanted to ask that given the present challenges of domestic unrest and the commercial slavery we have to China right now, what should aspiring statesmen be considering and studying right now in preparation for the republic that we hopefully will still have in 20 to 30 years? That way, we can lead it better than our forefathers did.
Well, unfortunately, most of classical history, Polybius and Plutarch to some degree, but especially the the Roman nihilists, if I could use that term, Suetonius, Petronius, Tacitus, they all talk about decline as if a civilization is like a human body. It ages, it has stages of adolescence, adulthood, aging, senility, death. And so the republic or the city-state does. All nations do that. But that being said, throughout all of these classical paradigms, there's this idea of virtue, that cities, states, nations, as they get wealthier and they get more successful, the appetites of the citizens are more easily satisfied. And sometimes the criteria by which you adjudicate that are pretty crude. People sleep longer, they eat more, they have more sex, the divorce rate's high. These are ancient concepts. And the diet gets richer, Trimalchio's banquet. But what I'm getting at is that if a society cannot retain virtue, and virtue is usually defined in the ancient world as some sense of transcendence. Maybe if it's not religion, that you have a soul. I'm now borrowing a little bit from Plato. If you have a soul that lives beyond you, that's transcendence. Or if you plant an olive tree when you're 90 years old, you're never going to see it come to fruition, but you do it for your great grandkids. So that's important, that a person has an idea that he's living for somebody in the future. And so he makes investments rather than satisfies his own appetites. And then the other thing is that moderation, that pretty much everything in the ancient world that's excessive is bad. So whatever you want to do, whether it's eat, don't eat too much. Don't have too many girlfriends. Don't drink too much. Don't brag too much. That's, I think, one of the things. And that sort of answers the prior question about Athens. And Thucydides is not necessarily complimentary of radical Athenian democracy, given its demagogic propensities of the Oikos, but he does give it his due. He says after the disaster in Sicily that the democracy became very, very sophisticated in restoration. And he says that's what democracies do. They have all of these assets and imagination, and they can gear up, sort of like the United States producing more GDP than every country in World War II by 1945, or having a fleet by January 1945 that had more ships than every navy in the world, when we were not even close in 1941. That being said, that same utility and that same rambunctiousness and aggressiveness can also be, if it's not tamed or controlled or bridled, devastating. So after Arginusae, we're told by Xenophon that pretty much they could have had a negotiated victory, going back to the status before the war, which would have been an Athenian victory. And what did they do? They rejected it on the principle that, well, the Spartans wouldn't be asking for an armistice unless they thought we were going to win. So let's keep going and rub their nose in it. And by the way, let's execute all the generals that gave us the victory. And that's a trait of Athenian democracy. So volatile, rambunctious, not steady, but somebody brilliant like Thucydides has enough disinterested acumen to see that that's a very dangerous enemy, because they have a lot more imagination than the Spartans. And the Spartans just have to do the same old, and hope that they'll be excessive. And that's what happened. But of course, that took 27 years. I don't know if we have time for another question from the audience.
No, I don't think, I think we're out of time, but I also think that's a wonderful note to end on, that, you know, when we think about what to study and learn, focus on virtue, avoid excess. And this is the thing to do. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you all.
Wonderful conversation. Thanks everyone who is in the audience tonight too. Thanks.
Thank you.